On an autumn morning in 2011, a patrol officer driving the rural road toward Austin Bergstrom Airport noticed a black garbage bag caught in the brush along the shoulder. It looked at first like ordinary trash. He might have driven past it, but something made him stop. Perhaps the odd shape of the bag, perhaps only instinct. On an autumn morning in 2011, a patrol officer driving the rural road toward Austin Bergstrom Airport noticed a black garbage bag caught in the brush along the shoulder. It looked, at first, like ordinary trash. He might have driven past it, but something made him stop. Perhaps the odd shape of the bag, perhaps only instinct. What was inside quickly drew the attention of the crime scene unit. A floral patterned headscarf, marked with dark stains. Family photographs of small children, torn cleanly in half. A cell phone, its SIM card removed, and the device itself broken apart. And, most critically, several invoices and receipts made out in one man's name. That name was already familiar to the detectives' desks. 6 months earlier, a 63-year-old woman named Eleanor Voss had vanished from her farmhouse in Travis County. Her family had been wearing down the doors of police stations for months, and now, inside a garbage bag, lay the most personal fragments of that woman's life. When Detective Laura Simmons arrived at the scene, she crouched over the bag and said nothing for a long while. One of her colleagues later described her expression in that moment. It was as though she understood that an answer she'd been searching for 6 months had arrived, in the worst possible way. Not relief, not shock, just a long, deep exhaustion. A headscarf, torn photographs, a broken phone, and a name printed across several receipts. None of it on its own proved a killing, but together it signaled that a question left unanswered for 6 months was about to be asked inside a courtroom. What had happened to Eleanor Voss? The technician leading the crime scene team would later say in an interview, "I've opened hundreds of garbage bags in my career. Most of them really are just trash. But when we opened this one, there was an intentionality to how the contents had been gathered together, as if someone had wanted to collect everything they were leaving behind into a single place. This wasn't random disposal." Eleanor Voss had emigrated to Germany as a young woman. For 32 years, she and her husband Walter worked in factories together. Night shifts, weekend overtime, never a complaint. Most immigrants who have lived in Europe know holding on there is not easy. But Eleanor and Walter, standing back to back, built a modest fortune. Their dreams were simple: houses for their children, a future for their grandchildren, a peaceful retirement for themselves. So they bought a small farmhouse in rural Texas, half an hour outside Austin. There would be fruit trees in the yard. Eleanor would grow vegetables. Maybe the grandchildren would spend summers there. The dreams were humane and modest. Everything was going well, until 2007, when Walter suffered a heart attack at the farmhouse. The ambulance didn't arrive in time. Eleanor lost the love of her life and 50 years of shared struggle. Now, in that small farmhouse, she was alone. Eleanor's literacy was limited, particularly when it came to financial matters and official paperwork. Her years in German factories had given her the courage to build a life, but not the knowledge to manage American property transactions, bank accounts, and lease agreements on her own. She needed help, and she asked for that help from her husband's nephew. There was another reality as well. Eleanor's 2 children, Karen and her brother, still lived in Germany. From across the Atlantic, it wasn't easy for them to genuinely intervene in their mother's daily life. Phone calls, video calls, all of it existed, but knocking on a door and walking in, sitting down to a meal and observing wasn't possible. That distance, without anyone realizing it, opened space for Dean. Dean Voss was Walter's nephew, in his early 30s, experienced with property transactions, far more comfortable with English and financial paperwork than Eleanor. Walter had already leaned on Dean's help when purchasing the farmhouse. After her husband's death, Eleanor turned to him as the natural choice. "You collect the rent from my tenants," Eleanor had said. "Watch over my money carefully. Drive me where I need to go. In return, I'll pay you a wage. Let it be an exchange, both ways." Dean agreed. Within a short time, he had become Eleanor's right hand, rent collection, banking, errands, doctor's appointments. He handled everything. But within a small community, this closeness did not go unnoticed. A woman in her 60s being seen constantly with a nephew in his 30s set off gossip. Whispers grew. Neighbors began asking questions. Eleanor grew uncomfortable with the situation, for her own reputation and for Dean's. Eventually, she began giving a different answer to those who asked. "Dean and I are together, an informal, simple arrangement. This way, they'll leave both of us alone. We'll be free of the gossip." That explanation stopped the whispers, but it also changed the balance between them forever. When Eleanor made that statement, she likely could not have imagined how far-reaching its consequences would become. For her, it was simply a practical sentence meant to quiet the gossip. But for Dean, that same sentence opened an entirely different door. He was no longer just a helper, but someone who appeared to be part of the family, and that appearance gave him a sense of legitimacy he should never have had. After that informal arrangement explanation, everything changed. Dean was no longer simply a helper. He began, increasingly openly, to assert a claim over the fortune Eleanor had spent years accumulating. "I'm going to start a business," he would say often. "I need money." Eleanor refused, every time. "This money isn't mine," Eleanor would say. "It belongs to my children, my grandchildren. I can't give it to you." But Dean's insistence didn't diminish. If anything, it grew slightly larger after each refusal. The balance of power between them had visibly shifted. The nephew who once helped had become a man demanding entitlement. One neighbor later told police, "Eleanor mentioned to me once that Dean wasn't like he used to be. He was treating her less like someone he helped and more like someone who owed him." Eleanor's daughter Karen had also noticed tension in her mother's voice during phone calls, but hadn't known exactly why. As the months passed, the tension grew, and one evening in 2009, Dean invited Eleanor to the farmhouse to talk through these matters once and for all. Eleanor agreed. That evening, they went to the farmhouse together, and that night, everything sank into darkness. No one thought that evening was strange. Dean and Eleanor had discussed the same subjects many times over the preceding months, sometimes calmly, sometimes tensely, but always within the same house, in a familiar setting. That evening looked no different. Eleanor put her keys in her bag, as she always did, locked her door, and gave a quick wave to a neighbor as she got in the car. No one knew it would be her last journey. According to Dean's initial statement, they had met at the farmhouse that evening. At some point, Eleanor had said she wanted to go into town. Dean claimed he dropped her off. "And then I never heard from her again," he told police. "I'm as baffled as anyone." Days passed with no word from Eleanor. Her family began searching in a state of panic. Karen called her mother's phone again and again, always unanswered. Eleanor's brother, Victor Keller, flew from Germany to Texas. They went to the police. But at first, they were met with the assumption that an adult woman might simply have chosen to disappear on her own. In desperation, the family reached out to a television program that investigated missing persons, Missing in America. Karen and Victor appeared on screen, showing Eleanor's photographs, asking for any information. At the family's insistence, Dean appeared on the same program, in front of the camera, in a calm voice, repeating that he knew nothing. But at one point in the program, the host asked Victor directly, "Who do you believe is responsible?" Victor answered without a moment's hesitation, "The only person responsible for my sister's disappearance is Dean Voss." Silence fell over the studio. Dean turned to the camera and repeated the same sentence. "I absolutely deny that. She only gave me power of attorney. I was handling her affairs, driving her around. Nothing else is true." Ruth Palmer, 60 years old, was a retired schoolteacher who lived directly across from the farmhouse. When she took the stand, her voice was hesitant. Clearly, she hadn't wanted to come, but she had been called. "I knew Eleanor well," she said. "We used to talk about the tomato seedlings in her garden. She was a good neighbor." Ada Castillo asked, "Did you ever notice any tension between Eleanor and Dean?" After a long silence, Ruth answered, "Once, I heard them from my yard. Voices were raised. Dean was shouting, "This is my right too." Eleanor kept saying, "No," again and again. Then a door slammed. "When did you hear this?" Castillo asked. "About 2 weeks before she disappeared." Bennett asked in cross-examination, "Miss Palmer, why didn't you report this to police sooner?" Ruth answered without looking away, "Because I thought it was a family argument. I didn't want to intrude on my neighbor's business. But now I think every day about how I wish I had knocked on that door and asked." Her voice broke there. The room listened to that regret in silence. Ruth Palmer's testimony surfaced. Once again, perhaps the most recurring theme of the entire case. Neighbors, family members, friends. They often see the signs of danger, but the instinct not to get involved frequently wins out over speaking up. And sometimes that silence exacts an irreversible price. After the trial ended, Ruth Palmer started a neighborhood committee, an informal network, encouraging neighbors to share the things they found strange with one another. "Maybe we were too late," she said in one interview, "but I don't want anyone to ever again pay this heavier price for staying silent." For 6 months, nothing was found. No lead, no witness, no trace. Detective Laura Simmons reopened the file again and again, but she had nothing concrete in hand. Only a story of family tension and a missing woman. Neighbors and relatives questioned Dean, not officially, but among themselves. "Why were you photographed holding your aunt's hand?" they asked. Dean denied it. "That's not what that photo shows." "Should I believe my own eyes, or should I believe you?" Questions like these showed that people around them suspected the nature of the relationship, but none of it, on its own, was proof of a crime. Karen tried on her own to examine her mother's phone records. She went to the bank, asked about account activity. But without a formal court order, most doors remained closed to her. "They didn't understand," she said later in an interview. "I didn't want my mother to become a case number. I wanted to know she was alive." 6 months felt like an eternity to a family. With every passing day, hope diminished a little further. And it was precisely in the midst of that despair that a patrol officer, driving a rural road, noticed a black bag caught in the brush. When forensic accountant Warren Doyle took the stand, he carried a presentation showing Eleanor Voss's bank account activity. In the 12 months before her disappearance, he said, a total of $340,000 had been transferred from Eleanor Voss's account into one controlled by Dean Voss. The room stirred slightly at that figure. Doyle continued, "The early transfers were small, rent collections, reasonable amounts for daily expenses, but in the final 3 months, the size of the transfers suddenly increased. One single transfer moved $85,000 at once." ADA Castillo asked, "What was the stated reason for this large transfer?" Doyle, "There's no explanation in the records. It's only marked personal expense." Doyle shared another detail. 3 weeks before her disappearance, Eleanor Voss went to her bank and filed a request to restrict Dean Voss's authority over the account. The bank had begun processing that request, but it was never completed before Eleanor vanished. That finding created new weight in the room. Eleanor had sensed the danger and had tried to act. Bennett objected in cross-examination. "Mr. Doyle, were all of these transfers made with Eleanor Voss's own approval?" "On paper, yes," Doyle said. "But her going to the bank to try to restrict that authority raises questions about how voluntary those approvals truly were." That answer settled in the jury's mind as evidence of how a relationship that had once begun as a mutual arrangement had gradually turned into one-sided control. Doyle added one more thing. "I've reviewed patterns like this dozens of times. Typically, as the victim's resistance increases, the exploiting party's tactics shift as well, from requests to threats, from threats to pressure. I saw exactly that pattern in this case." The room held on to that observation, to be joined later by the testimony still to come. When Detective Simmons took the stand, the file in her hands was thick. "We analyzed the contents of the recovered bag piece by piece," she said. "The stains on the headscarf were confirmed as human blood in laboratory testing, and the DNA profile matched Eleanor Voss's biological relatives." The room fell silent at that sentence. "The invoices and receipts in the bag," Simmons continued, were tied directly to purchases attributed to Dean Voss, large plastic bags from a shipping supply company, and grass seed and fertilizer from a garden supply store. At this point, Ada Castillo asked a question. How did the dates of these purchases align with Eleanor Voss's disappearance? Simmons: they were made 2 days after the date she vanished. The room tried to absorb this information. Grass seed, fertilizer, large plastic bags. Each of those three, on its own, could point to a simple gardening project. But appearing on invoices tied to the same man 2 days after Eleanor's disappearance, that was a pattern growing increasingly difficult to explain away as coincidence. Harold Bennett objected in cross-examination. Detective Simmons, is purchasing garden supplies a crime? No, Simmons said calmly. But these purchases being found in the same bag as a missing woman's blood-stained headscarf is not, on its own, a coincidence. Bennett sat down. But the room had felt the weight of that answer. On its own, no single piece was enough. A scarf, an invoice, a patch of fresh grass. But together, they all pointed in the same direction, and that direction had become too clear to ignore. Forensic expert Dr. Priya Anand took the stand with clear clinical precision. The DNA analysis we performed on the recovered evidence, she said, confirmed with 99.99% confidence that the blood on the headscarf belonged to Eleanor Voss. Ada Castillo then asked, what does this finding indicate about the likelihood the victim is still alive? Dr. Anand answered carefully. The volume of blood and the distribution of the stains indicate a serious injury, but a definitive determination of death would require the recovery of a body. That answer left both a crumb of hope and a deep fear in the room. If there was no body, how would the case proceed? Dr. Anand continued. The family photographs torn in half, particularly the images of the grandchildren, carry significant indication from a forensic psychology standpoint. This kind of act is typically associated not with rage, but with a desire to sever the connection to the victim entirely. As the room listened to this explanation, it began to consider just how coldly calculated a person's actions might have been. Bennett asked one final question. Dr. Anand, none of this evidence proves my client directly carried out these acts, does it? Anand answered honestly. Correct. My job is to determine what happened, not who did it. That answer opened the door to the next phase of the trial. Determining who did it would fall to cross-examination. As Dr. Anand stepped down, the room settled into silence. Forensics had presented the truth it held, cold, precise, indisputable. But the question of why a person could go this far still had no answer, and that answer would come only from Dean Voss's own mouth. Karen Voss Whitfield, 35, had regularly flown from Germany to Texas to visit her mother in her final years. When she took the stand, her voice trembled, but her sentences held steady. Ada Castillo asked her about her relationship with her mother. My mother was an independent woman, Karen said. She'd been through hard days, but never gave up. Losing her this way, I still can't believe it. Karen continued. At first I was grateful to Dean. My mother was alone, and someone was helping her. But over time, I noticed a tension in her voice during our calls. When I asked, she'd say everything's fine, but I knew something wasn't right. Ada Castillo asked, did your mother ever directly share a concern with you? Once, Karen said, her voice tightening. She told me Dean was being insistent about money. But she said, I'll handle it. She always said, I'll handle it. Karen described the days following her mother's disappearance. I called her every day. No answer. I got on a plane, came to Texas. I asked Dean, where is she? He told me, in a calm voice, I dropped her in town. I don't know. That calmness, even then, it struck me as strange. Can a person really stay that calm when someone they care about goes missing? Karen's testimony brought no concrete evidence to the court, only a daughter's observations of her mother's final months. But those observations laid the first stones of a pattern that would, in the room's mind, later merge with the forensic evidence still to come. As Karen stepped down from the stand, she paused for a moment and looked directly at Dean. For the first time since the trial began, Dean looked away. That small moment never made it into any record, any transcript, but everyone seated in the room saw it and remembered it. As the weight of the evidence grew, the prosecution obtained a search warrant for the farmhouse garden. Detective Simmons described the search from the stand. We used ground-penetrating radar technology. In one specific section of the garden, we detected irregularities beneath the soil, an area that had been freshly dug and then refilled. Simmons explained the technology simply for the jury. Ground radar detects differences in density beneath the surface. Undisturbed soil shows a certain pattern. Soil that has been dug up and refilled carries a different density profile. It leaves a trace, as though the ground had been opened and closed once before. That explanation helped the jury understand the technical finding. What was notable, Simmons continued, was that the grass in this section appeared visibly younger than the rest of the garden. We consulted a horticultural expert. The expert determined this grass had likely been planted approximately 6 months earlier, a time frame that aligned exactly with the date of Eleanor Voss's disappearance. The excavation team began working the marked area. Within a few hours, remains wrapped in plastic bags were found beneath the soil. The forensic team confirmed through DNA testing that the remains belonged to Eleanor Voss. The room fell into complete silence as it listened to this testimony. Months of uncertainty had now turned into a painful certainty. During the excavation, the team members barely spoke to one another. Only signals, brief hand gestures. This wasn't their usual way of working, but this time the silence was a form of respect. A wordless respect shown to the truth waiting beneath the soil. Karen Voss Whitfield, in the gallery, gripped the tissue in her hand tightly as she listened to this testimony. She didn't cry. Perhaps the tears she had been holding for months were already spent. She simply lowered her head and whispered her mother's name. In a final report, the excavation team noted they had found one more small object beside the remains. A thin gold ring Eleanor was said to have never removed. The ring was cleaned and returned to the family. Karen keeps it today beside her mother's photograph, on the mantel of her own home. The prosecution called forensic psychologist Dr. Howard Ellery to provide behavioral context. My role, Ellery said as he took the stand, is not to diagnose the defendant. It is to assess whether the pattern presented by the prosecution has a recognized counterpart in psychiatric literature. ADA Castillo summarized the broad outline of the case and asked, "How would you characterize a pattern like this?" Ellery answered carefully, "What's described in this case is a classic pattern of financial exploitation, but with an important distinction. Typically in such situations, the exploiting party is content to take advantage of the victim's vulnerability. Here, the victim showed strong resistance, drew boundaries, and that resistance may have triggered the exploiting party's fear of losing control." The room listened to that explanation in silence. Bennett asked in cross-examination, "Dr. Ellery, you never examined my client, correct?" "Correct. And this pattern you describe can exist without violence?" "Yes, absolutely." Bennett sat down, but Castillo's redirect was brief. "Dr. Ellery, in this case, was this pattern observed alongside violence?" Ellery, "Yes." This testimony clarified, once again, perhaps the case's most crucial question: what was Dean Voss actually chasing? The answer wasn't simply money. It was control over a woman's life, her decisions, and her future. And when that control began slipping from his grasp, the consequences became irreversible. Before stepping down, Ellery left the jury with a brief caution. A pattern like this often goes unnoticed from the outside because love and control sometimes speak the same language. The difference only becomes visible when you look back. Those words echoed through the room for a long while. When Dean Voss took the stand, his voice was still controlled. "I never harmed Eleanor," he said. "I dropped her off in town. I don't know what happened after that." ADA Castillo began her questioning at a calm pace. "Mr. Voss, who planted that new grass in your garden?" "I don't know," Dean said. "Maybe it was already there." "And these invoices," Castillo said, holding up the receipts for grass seed and plastic bags, "were issued in your name. Why did you purchase these?" Dean paused for a moment. I don't remember. Maybe for yard work. 2 days after the disappearance date, Dean didn't answer. The room felt that silence. Castillo continued her questions, calm, persistent, never rising in volume. Each question widened a crack in Dean's account a little further. Eventually, Dean's hands began to tremble. His voice grew hoarse. "We started arguing about money," he said, almost in a whisper. "She stood up to me again. I couldn't take it." The room was completely silent. Dean continued, "I beat her first, then I strangled her. Once I was sure she was dead, in the bathroom, I did the rest. I bagged it. I buried it in the garden. I planted grass over it." Judge Rourke removed her glasses and said nothing for a long moment. The room seemed to be holding its breath beneath the weight of that confession. Without raising her voice, ADA Castillo asked one final question. "Mr. Voss, why did you tear the photographs of Eleanor's grandchildren in half?" Dean didn't answer for a long moment. Finally, in a voice close to a whisper, "I don't know. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about anything." That answer left no satisfying explanation in the room's mind for how a person could act with such coldness, only the trace of a darkness that would never fully be understood. ADA Renee Castillo never once raised her voice in her closing argument. "This case," she said, "was never about money. It was about power, a woman's right to hold on to control over her own life, and a man's willingness to take that control away from her." Eleanor Voss worked for 32 years, saved for 32 years, and in the end was killed in her own home by the very person she trusted. In his closing, Harold Bennett tried to argue that his client's confession had been given under duress. A long cross-examination, exhaustion, panic, these can call the reliability of a confession into question. But that argument stood weak against the weight of a confession that was clear, detailed, and fully on the record. The jury did not take that objection seriously. Judge Rourke gave the jury their instructions: weigh the evidence independent of emotion, but this court notes that the defendant's own confession, given in his own words, stands at the center of this case. The gavel came down. The jury retired. This time, the wait was not long. The jury returned within just a few hours. Everyone already knew the verdict was clear. The confession had changed everything. During those few hours, Karen and Victor sat on the courthouse steps, not speaking, simply side by side. A reporter tried to ask them something, but Victor only shook his head and quietly raised his hand. Some moments don't need words. The jury foreperson rose. On the charge of first-degree intentional murder, the jury finds the defendant Dean Voss guilty. A faint murmur rose through the room, but no one was surprised. Dean showed no reaction. He simply lowered his head. At the sentencing hearing, Judge Rourke sentenced Dean Voss to 18 years in prison. But that ruling was not the end of the case. The state appellate court reviewed the file and determined the sentence was not proportionate to the severity of the crime. In the retrial, the sentence was converted to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. When the ruling was read, Karen Voss Whitfield, in the gallery, let her tears fall freely for the first time. Victor Keller pressed a photograph of his sister to his chest. Eleanor Voss worked for 32 years. She built a life. She raised a family. She dreamed of a peaceful retirement. And in the end, she lost her life in her own garden, at the hands of a nephew she had trusted. Her story now lives not inside a court file, but in the memory of her family. Karen stayed in Texas for a few more months after the trial, to gather her mother's belongings, sell the property, and, perhaps hardest of all, to leave behind a life that would never return. Victor went back to Germany, but every year, on the anniversary of his sister's death, he flew back to Texas. Some losses are never fully closed by any court ruling. In the years that followed, this case began to be taught in statewide forensic accounting training as a case study, a lesson in how financial exploitation can quietly, step by step, embed itself inside a relationship of trust. Perhaps Eleanor Voss's legacy would live on not only within her family, but in the attention of those who, after her, might recognize a similar danger in time. The only thing lost in this case was not one woman's life. A family's dreams were lost as well. A peaceful retirement, summers spent together, fruit trees that would grow in a garden. All of it was buried in darkness in a single night. The most important point in this case was not money. It was the desire for possession. What Dean Voss wanted was not simply a sum of dollars. It was control over a woman's life, her decisions, and her future. Money was only the instrument of that desire. And you who have listened to this story, may now ask yourself, when does trust within a family become a vulnerability? The answer may lie not in trust itself, but in who comes to see that trust as having no limits. Today, that farmhouse in rural Texas has been sold to another family. The grass in the garden is now just grass. But for Eleanor Voss's family, that ground will never be ordinary again. And every year, on Eleanor's birthday, someone sends a flower from afar, in handwriting no one has ever been able to identify. Perhaps the most lasting lesson of this case is this: trust, no matter how close the person, should never be exempt from accountability. Eleanor Voss trusted a nephew because she needed help. To call that a mistake would be wrong. It was simply being human. But sometimes, even the most human trust can exact the heaviest price. Eleanor Voss's name today sits printed on the cover of a court file, cold, official, beside a case number. But for those who knew her, that name still belongs to tomato seedlings growing in a garden, coffee shared at a kitchen table, and a love that should never have run out.